My boss fired me in front of 11 people on a Tuesday afternoon in April. He did not call me into his office. He did not send a calendar invite that I could interpret privately before the moment arrived. He waited until I was standing at the head of the conference room table presenting quarterly results. My quarterly results. The numbers I had spent 3 months producing. And then he interrupted me mid-sentence in front of my entire team and said, "I think this is a good time to tell everyone that we'll be making some changes to the leadership structure." I stood at the head of that table for the next 4 minutes while he explained that my position was being eliminated. He used words like restructuring and strategic realignment and thanking Naomi for her contributions. He did not look at me once. 11 people watched. Some looked at the table. 2 looked at me with expressions that would qualify, if you were being generous, as sympathy. When he finished, he said, "Naomi, HR will connect with you." Then he turned back to the room and said, "Now, let's pick up where we left off." I gathered my notebook and my laptop. I walked out of the conference room. The door clicked behind me. I stood in the hallway for approximately 10 seconds, and then I walked to my office, sent an email to my assistant letting her know I was leaving, collected 3 personal items, and walked out of the building. My name is Naomi, and 3 years after that Tuesday in April, my former boss stood in front of me in a hotel conference room and asked me to save his company. I want to tell you what those 3 years looked like. Not the dramatic version, the real one. The first month was the worst. I had been at Archer Consulting for 7 years. I was a vice president of strategy. I had a team of 12 and a client portfolio worth $42 million in annual billings. I had given that company 7 years of 70-hour weeks and 3 canceled vacations and 1 Christmas where I worked from my parents' living room in Atlanta while my mother watched me with the particular expression of a woman who loves you and cannot understand your choices. Marcus, that was my boss's name, Marcus Whitmore, had hired me at 31 as a senior manager and promoted me twice. He had told me 18 months before the Tuesday in April that I was the future of the practice. He had told a client in front of me that I was the most strategically sophisticated person in the building. He fired me in front of 11 people, without warning, without cause, and without the basic professional dignity of a private conversation. The reason, which I pieced together over the following weeks through a combination of conversations with former colleagues and documents I was entitled to as part of my separation agreement, was this. Archer Consulting had been approached about a merger with a larger firm. The larger firm had their own VP of strategy, a man named Derek, who was less experienced than me and had produced measurably worse results over the previous 2 years. The merger would require eliminating one of the 2 VP positions. Marcus had chosen to eliminate mine. He had not told me about the merger. He had not given me an opportunity to negotiate. He had made the decision privately, announced it publicly, and walked out of the conference room where I had been humiliated in front of my team without once saying my name to my face. I learned later that Derek had been aware of the merger for 4 months. The second month was where I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be on the other side of this. I want to tell you that I made a clean decision and followed it cleanly. That is not true. What actually happened is that I spent approximately 6 weeks being angrier than I have ever been in my adult life. And then I spent another 6 weeks being frightened. And then somewhere in the middle of month 3, I got very quiet and very clear and started thinking about what I was actually going to do. I had savings. I had skills. I had a reputation, 7 years of results, 42 million in billings, a client list full of people who had worked with me personally and trusted my judgment. I had 3 former colleagues who called me in the first week to say, in different ways, that what had happened was wrong and that they would support me however they could. I had options. That took a while to see clearly. I started consulting independently. Not immediately. I spent the first 2 months talking to people, thinking, being very deliberate about where I wanted to go. By month 4, I had 2 clients. By month 6, I had 4. By the end of the first year, my independent practice was generating more revenue than my salary at Archer had been. This is not a story about overnight success. That first year was extremely hard in ways that don't make good storytelling. There were weeks where I questioned every decision. There were mornings where I sat at the desk in my home office and thought about Marcus Whitmore and the conference room and did not start working for 45 minutes because I was too angry to think straight. But I started. Every time. I always started. The clients came because of the work. That is the thing I most want you to understand about the 3 years between the Tuesday in April and the hotel conference room. The clients did not come because of my feelings about Marcus. They did not come because of the injustice or the public humiliation or the anger that took months to metabolize. They came because I was good at my work, and I had been good at it for years before he fired me, and that quality did not go away when he eliminated my position. The work is the thing. It is always the thing. By the middle of year 2, I had a small team, 3 people, all of whom I had hired personally, all of whom I knew well enough to trust. We were doing work I was proud of at a level I had not been able to achieve inside a larger institutional structure. I was making decisions faster. I was serving clients better. I was sleeping more. The company was called Vantage Strategy. I had named it at 3 a.m. during the 4th week, when I was still too raw to be entirely sure it was the right name, and I have never changed it, because the rawness was part of what named it. Vantage, the position from which you see clearly, from the high point, after you have climbed. Year 3 was the year things got very good. A Fortune 100 company approached me about a major engagement, a full strategic overhaul of their North American operations. It was the largest contract I had ever touched, larger than anything I had managed at Archer. I put together a proposal that I am still proud of. We won the engagement. I am telling you all of this so that when I describe the hotel conference room, you understand exactly where I was standing when Marcus Whitmore walked in. The conference was an industry event, the kind of 2-day gathering that the consulting world holds annually at nice hotels and calls a summit. I had been invited to speak on a panel about the future of independent strategy practices. I was, at this point, someone who got invited to speak on panels. That had not been true 3 years earlier. I was in the hotel restaurant having coffee before the panel when my phone buzzed. A text from a number I did not recognize. "Hi, Naomi. It's Marcus Whitmore. I heard you're at the conference. Would you have time for a coffee? I'd like to catch up." I sat with that text for approximately 4 minutes. Then I wrote, "Sure, coffee lounge, 10 a.m.? He arrived at 9:58. He looked older than I remembered. Not dramatically, just in the way that 3 years look on someone who has been under pressure. He was wearing a suit that was slightly less expensive than the ones he used to wear, which I noted without meaning to. He ordered coffee. He made approximately 90 seconds of small talk about the conference. Then he said, "I'll get to the point." I said, "Please." He said, "The merger with Caldwell Group has not gone the way we hoped. Derek left 8 months ago. The practice has lost 3 major clients in the last year. We are..." He paused. "We are in a difficult position." I waited. He said, I wanted to ask if you would be interested in coming back. In a senior capacity, we would be open to discussing a partnership structure. I looked at him across the coffee table. This was the moment. I want to tell you that I had imagined this moment because I had. Not obsessively, not as a daily practice, but in the way that people who have been wronged sometimes construct the hypothetical confrontation in idle moments. I had imagined being cold. I had imagined being direct about what he had done. I had imagined various versions of what it would feel like to hear him ask. What I had not imagined was how little I would feel. Not nothing. I want to be precise. There was something, a distant recognition of the shape of it, the symmetry of the moment. But the anger that had taken 6 weeks to begin metabolizing and another year to fully process was not present in the room with me. It had been replaced by something more useful and less dramatic: clarity. I looked at Marcus Whitmore across a hotel coffee table, and I understood something I had not fully understood before. He was not the central figure of my story. He had been, for a period of months, a significant event in it, an event that had cost me, that had changed the direction of things, that had required everything I had to respond to correctly. But he was not the point. He had never been the point. I said, "I appreciate you reaching out." He waited. I said, "I'm not interested in returning to Archer. Vantage is where my work is, and it's going very well." He nodded slowly. He had expected this, or had prepared for it. He said, "I understand. I owe you an apology. The way your departure was handled was not appropriate. I should have spoken with you privately." I looked at him. He said, "I handled it poorly." I want to be honest. The apology landed somewhere. It did not resolve anything. It did not give me back the Tuesday in April, or the 11 people watching, or the 4 minutes of restructuring and strategic realignment. But it was an acknowledgement, and acknowledgements matter. I said, "Thank you for saying that." He said, "Is there anything, any consulting engagement, any way Vantage and Archer might work together that would make sense?" I looked at him for a moment. I said, "Send me a brief on what you're dealing with. I'll take a look." He sent it that evening. I read it. I forwarded it to my team. We discussed it. We passed. The engagement was not the right fit, and my team's time was better deployed elsewhere. I sent Marcus a professional decline the following week. That was 6 months ago. I have not spoken to him since. I do not expect to. What I want to tell you is the thing I understood in that hotel coffee lounge, which I have been trying to articulate clearly ever since. The public firing did not define me. I defined my response to it. Those are different things, and the difference is everything. Marcus Whitmore stood in front of 11 people and eliminated my position mid-sentence and walked away. He did something genuinely wrong. He did it because the merger created a conflict, and he resolved it in the way that was most convenient for him and least fair to me. That is true. And also, what happened next was entirely mine. The savings that gave me time to think, the deliberateness with which I chose my first clients, the name at 3 a.m, the 3 people I hired who I trusted, the Fortune 100 engagement that I won on the strength of a proposal I wrote myself, the panel at the conference where a man who had once fired me mid-sentence sent me a text asking for coffee. All of that, mine. Not despite the Tuesday in April. Not in spite of Marcus Whitmore. not because of the anger or the humiliation or the 11 people watching. Those things were the event. What I built was the response. The response is who I am. My mother called me after the panel. She had watched it on the live stream. She watches everything I do on live streams now, which is the thing that would have seemed incomprehensible when I was in that conference room collecting 3 personal items. She said, "You looked very sure of yourself." I said, "I've been working on that." She said, "You always were. You just had to stop asking other people to confirm it." My mother is 70 and has never given a corporate presentation in her life and is usually right. Vantage Strategy is 4 people now, heading towards 6. The Fortune 100 engagement closed last month and has generated 2 referrals. I am working harder than I have ever worked and sleeping better than I have in a decade. The desk I work at is in an office I lease in Chicago, on a floor with 9 other small firms, and the window faces east, and in the morning the light comes directly in, and I have to adjust the blind, but I almost never do, because I like the light. Some mornings I sit at that desk and I think about the conference room, the 11 people, the 4 minutes, the way the door clicked behind me. And then I open my laptop and I start working. That is the whole story. The event and the response winning. If you were ever humiliated in a room and had to walk out of it and figure out what you were on the other side, you are not alone. And the other side is worth building. And the building is the point. There is something I want to tell you about year 2. The year that is hardest to describe because it was neither the crisis nor the recovery. It was the middle, which is where most of the real work happens and where almost none of the stories take place. Year 2 was the year I understood that building something on your own terms is fundamentally different from building something inside someone else's structure. At Archer, I had been good at my job within a framework that someone else had designed. The targets were set externally, the clients were mostly inherited, the culture, the process, the measure of success, all of it existed before I arrived and would exist after I left, which I knew because it did. The company continued without me. It is continuing now, smaller and struggling, but continuing. At Vantage, I was the framework. I set the targets. I chose the clients. I designed the process and the culture and the measure of success. This is harder than it sounds, not because the skills are different, they are largely the same skills, but because the feedback loops are different. At Archer, if I did something well, Marcus noticed or he didn't, the client noticed or they didn't, the quarterly numbers reflected it or they didn't. The validation was external and relatively reliable. At Vantage, the validation had to come from inside. I had to know, before the client confirmed it, whether the work was good. I had to trust my own judgment about what a successful engagement looked like. This is, I discovered, a muscle that requires significant development if you have spent your career in a structure where other people's assessments were the primary measure. I hired a coach in year 2. Her name was Patricia, and she was 63 and had built and sold 2 companies and had the particular quality of someone who had seen enough to stop being impressed by most things and was therefore genuinely impressive when something did earn her attention. In our 3rd session, she asked me, "What do you believe about yourself that you learned from Marcus Whitmore?" I said, "I don't understand the question." She said, "Somewhere in the 7 years you worked for him and the 4 minutes in the conference room, you absorbed a belief about what you are capable of. Some of what he told you was accurate and some of it was not. Which parts did you keep?" I thought about that for a long time. What I kept. The belief that I could produce results under pressure. The evidence that I could manage difficult clients. the knowledge that I could walk into a room and hold it. These were things Marcus had recognized in me and that the work had confirmed. What I had also kept, without knowing I had kept it, a version of his assessment of my ceiling, the sense that I needed his structure to function, the belief, operating mostly below conscious awareness, that my success at Archer had been partly his framework, his reputation, his endorsement. Patricia asked, "What would you have built if you had started at 28 instead of after the firing?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "That's the honest answer. But here's what I observe. You built Vantage after the firing with the skills you had developed before it. The skills were yours the entire time. The framework was his. He gave you the framework. You gave you the skills." I sat with that for a long time. The framework was his. The skills were mine. That reframe did not arrive fully formed. It arrived slowly, through a series of conversations with Patricia, and then through the accumulating evidence of the work itself. The clients I won, the proposals I wrote, the team I built, the decisions I made that turned out to be right, and the decisions I made that turned out to be wrong, and the recovery from both. By the end of year 2, I had stopped waking up thinking about the conference room. Not because I had decided to forgive Marcus, that is a more complicated question, but because the conference room had become a smaller percentage of the story I was living. When you are in the middle of a crisis, the crisis is everything. When you have been building for 2 years, the crisis is one event among many. My assistant at Archer, a woman named Keisha who had been with me for 4 years, sent me a card at the end of year 1. Just a card, handwritten, 5 sentences. She said she had heard what I was building. She said she wanted me to know that the team still talked about me. She said, "You were the reason that room worked." I kept that card. It is in a drawer in the east-facing office in Chicago. I do not read it often. I read it when I need to remember that what Marcus said in front of 11 people on a Tuesday in April was his story about me, and that the people who had actually worked alongside me for 7 years had a different story, and that their version was also a version, and that the accumulation of all of them is closer to truth than any single one. Marcus Whitmore's story about me is not the authoritative version. Mine is. The panel I spoke on at the conference, the one I was preparing for when his text arrived, was about the future of independent strategy practices. I spoke for about 12 minutes. I talked about what I had learned in 3 years of building something from scratch, the importance of client selection, the difficulty of building culture in a small organization, the particular discipline of trusting your own judgment when there is no one above you to defer to. After the panel, 3 people came up to me separately and asked for my card. One of them became a client. One became a referral source. One sent me a long email 2 weeks later that said, "I left a company last year under difficult circumstances, and I'm trying to figure out what comes next. What you said about trusting your own judgment, I think that's where I am." I wrote back. We talked on the phone. I told her what I had learned in year 2. I told her, the skills are yours. The framework was theirs. That is the most useful thing I know. The office faces east, and the light comes in hard in the morning, and I adjust the blinds sometimes, and sometimes I don't. And either way, the work gets done, and the work is good, and the work is mine. That is enough. That has turned out to be entirely enough. Subscribe, because every story on this channel is real, it is raw, and it is worth your time. Drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? If you've ever had to walk out of a room and build something better on the other side, I want to hear your story. I read every single one.